The day Dolores was told she had to leave her home was the day everything inside her quietly began to fracture. It wasn't the first time she had sensed the cold distance growing between her and Jason, her son, the boy she had cradled in her arms, the one she had stayed up nights for when he was sick. But hearing it spoken aloud, as if she were a fragile object too worn to be cared for anymore, cracked something deep in her soul. "Mom, we think it's best for you to move into a care facility," Jason said, his voice hesitant but firm, as if he were delivering a verdict rather than a plea. Dolores looked at him, really looked at the man who now seemed a stranger. His eyes avoided hers, darting to Danielle's face for reassurance. The warmth, the love she remembered from those early years had been replaced by something else. Guilt? Obligation? Or maybe relief? She couldn't tell anymore. Her heart clenched not because of the fear of leaving her home, but because the person she trusted most had become the one who was pushing her away. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one by the window overlooking the garden she had tended for decades, the one that held memories of laughter, tears, and quiet evenings. It was no longer hers. The walls, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender, suddenly felt foreign, as if the essence of her life was being packed away with every box Jason's hands touched. As the day turned into evening, a strange numbness settled over her, a blend of shock, sorrow, and an inexplicable emptiness. She thought about the years she had poured into raising Jason, about the sacrifices made silently, the birthdays missed, the dreams deferred. Now, here she was, reduced to an inconvenience, a burden too heavy to carry. The realization was suffocating. Yet beneath the sadness, an ember of defiance sparked within her. This was not the end. She still had her mind, her voice, and the fierce love for the life she had lived. The fear was there, yes, but it was laced with a growing resolve to be seen, not as a helpless old woman, but as a person worthy of dignity and respect. But in that moment, all she could do was sit and watch the house she had called home for so long grow quieter, the echoes of the past lingering like ghosts that would not leave. The quiet betrayal of being left behind by your own blood is a pain that cuts deeper than any wound. And as the door closed behind her that day, Dolores realized she was not just leaving a house, she was stepping into an uncertain battle to reclaim her life. Betrayal isn't a sudden crack, it is a slow erosion, a quiet poisoning of the soul that happens in the spaces between words left unsaid and promises quietly broken. For Dolores, the weight of betrayal settled not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a dull ache that grew heavier with each passing day. It was in the way Jason no longer returned her calls, the way he skirted around conversations about the future, and the way his eyes, once full of warmth, now flickered with a coldness that made her heart shatter in silence. She remembered the countless nights spent awake, worrying about his childhood troubles, the sacrifices made so he could have a better life, the dreams she had set aside so he could chase his own. And now, standing alone in the hollow of their fractured relationship, the stark truth was undeniable. The son she had nurtured was slowly becoming a stranger. The man who had promised he would always be there was now the architect of her solitude. The feeling of abandonment was a living thing, slithering through the rooms she once filled with laughter, wrapping tightly around her chest with icy fingers. It whispered lies, reminding her that she was no longer needed, no longer loved. Dolores found herself staring into mirrors that reflected a woman she barely recognized, aged, fragile, and invisible. Her eyes, once bright with hope and pride, now mirrored the void left by a family who had turned away. What hurt the most wasn't the physical distance, but the emotional chasm that widened with every dismissive word, every glance of impatience. The subtle acts of neglect, the hurried phone calls, the excuses, all coalesced into a slow unraveling of trust. She was left grappling with the unbearable paradox of being both so close yet so utterly forsaken. In the silence of her lonely nights, Dolores wrestled with the sting of betrayal, not just from Jason, but from the life she thought she had built, from the memories that now felt like chains rather than anchors. She asked herself if love was ever truly unconditional, or if it too could be bartered away for convenience and comfort. The pain of being abandoned by those who should have been her sanctuary birthed a quiet rage within her, a burning need to reclaim her sense of self beyond the roles she had played: mother, caretaker, giver. Yet beneath the fury was a profound sadness, the mourning of a bond broken beyond repair. In that fragile, raw space of heartache, Dolores realized that abandonment was not just a physical separation, it was the erosion of identity, the shattering of a lifelong belief in belonging. And though she was betrayed and left behind, somewhere deep inside, a whisper of resilience stirred, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still find a way back to herself. In the quiet aftermath of abandonment, as the sharp sting of betrayal began to dull into a steady ache, something else took root deep within Dolores, a stubborn ember of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. The hollow loneliness that had threatened to swallow her whole instead became the crucible in which her resolve was forged. This was not the time for surrender, not when every fragment of her identity had been stripped away. If anything, losing everything had uncovered a fierce, untapped strength. Dolores began to see the world not as a place where she was cast aside, but as a battlefield where survival required cunning and courage. The despair that once shackled her now fueled a meticulous plan, quietly assembled in the recesses of her mind. It was a plan born from pain, yes, but also from clarity, the hard-earned knowledge that she could no longer rely on anyone else to fight for her. She had to become her own champion. Her days grew consumed with careful observation, analyzing the patterns of those who had turned their backs on her. There was no reckless anger, no hasty confrontation. Only a cold, calculating patience that made her feel almost foreign to herself. Dolores wrote down every slight, every unspoken slight, every missed call, every glance that cut deeper than any word could. Each detail was a piece of a larger puzzle she was determined to solve. The walls of her solitude transformed into a fortress, where she planned her moves like a seasoned strategist. She knew that reclaiming her dignity would require more than just emotional endurance. It demanded tangible change. Financial independence, social reintegration, the restoration of her voice, all became the pillars of her silent campaign. Dolores started attending community meetings, volunteering at shelters, slowly weaving herself back into the fabric of a world that had seemed indifferent. But the real battle was internal. Each morning, she confronted the gnawing doubts, the whispers of self-blame that threatened to undermine her will. Yet, with every step forward, she learned to silence those voices, replacing them with affirmations of her worth and purpose. The mirror no longer reflected a fragile woman abandoned by her family. It showed a survivor whose scars were badges of honor. When the time was right, Dolores began to reach out, not to beg for forgiveness or reconciliation, but to assert her presence. Letters carefully penned, conversations approached with quiet strength, moments seized to remind those who had forsaken her that she was not a ghost to be forgotten, but a force to be reckoned with. She sought not vengeance, but recognition, not destruction, but respect. The slow unfolding of her comeback was a testament to resilience, an unyielding refusal to be defined by pain. Dolores' journey was no longer about what was lost, but about what she could reclaim and rebuild. In her silence, there was power. In her solitude, strategy, and in her heartache, a relentless determination to rise. Monica Reeves was not just a lawyer. She was a quiet force of empathy wrapped in sharp intellect and relentless determination. When Dolores first stepped into Monica's modest office, the weight of her shattered world seemed almost visible in the way she clung to her coat, eyes wary, body taut with years of bruised trust. Monica recognized that look, not just the surface pain, but the raw, festering wound of someone who had been betrayed by those closest to her. It was the kind of pain that made people shrink inside themselves, building walls so high that even a lifeline seemed unreachable. As Monica listened, her own heart tightened with a mix of professional concern and personal compassion. Dolores spoke haltingly at first, the words heavy and guarded, as if revealing too much would open a floodgate she wasn't ready to face. But Monica's presence was steady, patient, a silent assurance that here, judgment would never come, only understanding and action. With every detail Dolores shared, the abandonment, the betrayal by her own son, the forced confinement in the nursing home, Monica's resolve solidified. This was no mere legal case. It was a battle to restore a woman's dignity, her autonomy, her very sense of self. Monica knew the law could be as cold and unyielding as the walls Dolores had been trapped behind. But she also knew it could be wielded as a weapon, a shield, a beacon. She began crafting a meticulous plan, one that balanced legal rigor with a nuanced understanding of Dolores's emotional scars. It wasn't just about the documents, the petitions, the hearings, it was about giving Dolores back her voice, piece by trembling piece. In their sessions, Monica encouraged Dolores to reclaim her narrative, to speak truths long silenced. This was more than legal preparation. It was therapy in disguise, a slow unspooling of years of pain so deep it had become tangled with Dolores's very identity. Monica helped her see herself not as a victim trapped by circumstance, but as a survivor poised to rewrite her story. The lawyer's guidance extended beyond courtroom strategy. Monica was often the one to sit with Dolores during lonely nights, answering frantic calls when fear and doubt threatened to pull her under. She was the steady presence who reminded Dolores that the system, flawed as it was, could bend if pressed with enough will and perseverance. Monica's belief in Dolores's strength became a mirror reflecting back a hope that had all but been extinguished. As the legal battles commenced, the tension between cold, impersonal statutes and the warmth of human resilience played out in every argument Monica presented. The fight to free Dolores from the nursing home was not just a fight for freedom, it was a struggle to reclaim identity, respect, and love long denied. Monica's voice carried the weight of that truth, and in the courtroom, her words were not just law, they were a lifeline thrown to a woman drowning in abandonment. In the end, the alliance between Dolores and Monica was more than lawyer and client. It was a quiet rebellion against invisibility, a testament to the power of human connection amid the harshest betrayals. Through Monica's help, Dolores began to see the dawn after the darkest night, not just a legal victory, but the first breath of a life reclaimed. The corridors of the nursing home had long since ceased to resemble anything close to sanctuary. To Dolores, they were no more than the sterile arteries of a quiet prison, each hallway lined with the muffled echoes of forgotten lives. Days passed like fog, gray, indistinct, filled with the scent of overcooked vegetables and industrial disinfectant. The weight of betrayal pressed on her chest like a stone she had learned to carry without protest. But something had begun to shift, something subtle but irreversibly human. The return of her will. It wasn't a grand epiphany. It began instead with a silence that felt too suffocating, too final. A silence where her name, her desires, her rights no longer existed. That was when Dolores realized if she didn't fight now, she would disappear entirely. Not just from society, but from herself. This wasn't just about leaving a facility. This was about refusing to die, while still breathing. Her first act of rebellion was small, refusing medication she knew dulled her mind. The nurses noticed, of course, but she masked her resistance behind polite confusion, a tired smile. They underestimated her. Everyone did. And perhaps that was her greatest weapon. With Monica Reeves now advocating for her on the outside, every visit carried more weight than just legal updates. Monica brought her books on elder rights, on power of attorney abuses, on estate fraud. Dolores read with the hunger of someone reclaiming their stolen literacy. She wasn't just preparing for court, she was preparing to rise. She began to document everything: staff behaviors, locked doors, denied phone calls, the subtle manipulations that kept residents pliant. Her memory sharpened, not despite the trauma, but because of it. But escape wasn't only physical. It was emotional, psychological. She had to unlearn the guilt that had been weaponized against her. Her son's cold dismissal echoed in her mind like a curse. This is for your own good. It wasn't. It had never been. And now, for the first time, she had someone who believed her enough to fight for her, not out of obligation, but conviction. The day they filed for emergency injunction was the first time Dolores felt air return to her lungs. Monica's voice in court was calm, deliberate, presenting evidence of manipulation, financial control, coercive confinement. Dolores sat beside her, hands trembling not with fear but with fury long suppressed. Every accusation against her son, every statement of her competence, every assertion of her autonomy was like a chisel to the stone that had encased her for too long. Cross-examination was brutal. The opposing counsel painted her as delusional, paranoid, an elderly woman desperate to rewrite history. But Dolores did not flinch. She spoke clearly, measured. Her voice wavered only when she described the day she was driven to the home like a piece of luggage, her name stripped from the mailbox without a word. Even the judge paused, the courtroom briefly suspended in the quiet weight of her grief. When the ruling came, temporary release pending full investigation, it was not accompanied by applause, only a simple nod from Monica. But to Dolores, it felt louder than any ovation. She stepped outside into the sunlight, as if seeing it for the first time. There were still court dates to come, a legal maze ahead. But she was free. Not rescued. Not released. Freed because she had fought. The car ride back to Monica's office was quiet. Dolores stared out the window, the city unfolding before her like a forgotten dream. She wasn't naive. Rebuilding would take time. Trust would be slow. But now she had a voice. And in the echo of that voice, she found something she had feared lost forever, herself. The day Dolores signed the papers to sell her house, the irony wasn't lost on her. It was the same house her late husband had built with his own hands, each beam and nail a quiet act of devotion. It had been her sanctuary for decades, and later, the stage for her betrayal. Her son had stood in its kitchen, sipping her tea, lying with a practiced ease as he plotted her removal. Now it was his. Legally. Ruthlessly. Claimed not by inheritance, but by theft veiled as love. Selling it felt like giving away a part of her body. But Dolores had come to understand something cruel yet empowering. Healing sometimes required burning down what hurt you. So she did. The decision to buy the house next door was not impulsive. It was calculated. Deliberate. She'd walked by it for years, never once imagining it might one day become her vantage point, her place of watchfulness, of reckoning. It wasn't revenge that moved her, but something far more haunting, the need to be seen again by the person who had erased her. To haunt him not with rage, but with presence. She moved in quietly. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a single moving truck, a few boxes of clothes, books, and fragments of a life that had survived forced confinement and public humiliation. The neighbors whispered, of course. They remembered her, remembered the scandal. Some pitied her. Others avoided eye contact. She didn't care. She wasn't there for them. Her son, Ethan, took longer to notice. He hadn't expected her to fight back, certainly not like this. When he finally saw her stepping out of her front door, just 20 feet from his own, the expression on his face was almost comical. Disbelief, dread, and something she hadn't seen in him for years. Fear. Dolores didn't greet him. She didn't wave. She simply met his gaze with a stillness that made the air between them feel razor-thin. There were no legal battles left to fight now. The house was hers. She had every right to be there. But this daily, silent confrontation, was her justice. There was power in that proximity. Not petty power, but the kind that emerges when someone reclaims the narrative others tried to bury. Each morning, Dolores opened her curtains deliberately, brewed her coffee by the window, and let Ethan feel her watching. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't running. She was a scar that refused to fade, a reminder of what he had done and what he had failed to destroy. At night, she wrote letters she never sent. Letters filled with the things she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. Sometimes she wrote as a mother begging to understand how her child had turned so cold. Other times she wrote as a witness documenting the anatomy of betrayal. She didn't know what she would do with them. Perhaps one day she'd leave them in his mailbox. Or perhaps they were just a way to keep from screaming. Ethan avoided her. He took the long way to his car, closed his blinds tighter, whispered furiously to his wife in the driveway. And Dolores remained unmoving, composed, watching him shrink beneath the weight of her presence. She wasn't there to provoke. She was there to exist. And that, she realized, was the greatest punishment of all, to be the living truth he had tried to erase, now impossible to ignore. Over time, her strength became its own kind of silence. Not passive, but dignified. She tended to her small garden. She walked around the neighborhood without shame. And slowly, the people who had once looked at her with pity began to nod in quiet respect. She had returned, not in flames, but in stone. Unbreakable, unmovable. In buying the house next door, Dolores didn't seek war. She sought acknowledgement, accountability. And while Ethan never offered either, not in words, she saw it in the tremble of his hand when their paths crossed, in the way he averted his eyes, in the shame that bloomed where arrogance had once lived. This was not reconciliation. It was not healing in the traditional sense. But it was something solid, something hers. And every time she stood on her porch and looked at the home she once lost, she reminded herself, she had not come back to beg. She had come back to be remembered. At first, Ethan told himself it was just a coincidence. That someone else, anyone else, had moved into the house next door. A widow, maybe, or a quiet pensioner with cats. He convinced himself of it until the morning he saw her silhouette through the window, moving with the same grace he remembered from childhood, her back impossibly straight despite the years and wounds. He didn't believe it, not truly, until he stepped outside to fetch the mail and saw her standing on the porch, coffee in hand, as if she had never left. As if she hadn't been locked away in a home he had chosen for her under the guise of love and concern. As if she hadn't been discarded. His chest constricted. Not with guilt, not at first. With fear. The kind of primal dread that comes not from what a person is doing, but from what they now know. She was supposed to fade, to disappear, to age quietly behind institutional walls, her mind too clouded to remember what he'd done. But now she was here, alert, watching, and worst of all, she was calm. That stillness, it unsettled him more than rage ever could. He didn't tell Amelia right away. His wife had been the first to suggest the nursing home, after all. It's not safe, she'd said with concern in her voice but calculation in her eyes. She forgets things. What if she leaves the stove on? What if she falls? They'd played the game of justification together. For the safety of the children. For peace of mind. For her own good. They rehearsed the lines until they almost believed them. But now, with Dolores next door, the lie was breaking open like a fault line beneath their neatly arranged life. Amelia found out 2 days later, stepping out to water the rose bushes, only to look up and see Dolores trimming a hedge, not 10 feet away. Their eyes met. Dolores didn't smile. She didn't look away either. She held Amelia's gaze with the cool precision of someone who had seen through her from the start. Amelia dropped the watering can. The sound of it hitting the bricks startled even the birds. That night, Ethan came home to find his wife pacing the living room, her lips pulled tight, her hands trembling as she demanded, "Did you know she bought the house?" When he nodded, something cracked between them, a fracture neither of them dared name. "She's going to tell people," Amelia hissed. "She's going to make us out to be monsters." Ethan didn't respond, because, deep down, he wasn't sure that wasn't true. The days that followed were a quiet unraveling. Amelia grew more erratic, glancing out the windows as though Dolores might be taking notes, documenting every move. She began rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened. "If she tries to say we forced her, no one will believe it. She signed the papers." She agreed. But her voice betrayed her desperation. It was the voice of someone who knew the difference between legal and right. Ethan began to avoid the front of the house. He parked down the street. He pulled the blinds tighter. Yet every time he walked past a mirror, he caught a flicker of his mother's face, not the woman she was now, but the one who had once kissed his scraped knees, who had read him bedtime stories with a voice full of patience and warmth. The betrayal now lived not just outside, but inside him, reflecting back through every quiet moment. Their children noticed the tension, the whispered arguments, the nervous glances toward the window. One night, their eldest daughter asked, "Why does Grandma live next door now?" And neither Ethan nor Amelia could answer. Because how do you explain to a child that you had once conspired to exile your own mother? That your fear of being burdened had outweighed your memory of being loved? Amelia tried to restore control in small, futile ways. She trimmed the hedges obsessively, repainted the mailbox, spoke loudly about family vacations they never actually took. But Dolores remained, a silent, unmovable presence, like a monument carved from guilt and time. The confrontation they feared never came, not in words. Dolores never raised her voice, never knocked on their door. But her silence was not empty. It was full of memory, of disappointment, of the quiet endurance only a mother could master. And that, more than anything, undid them. In the end, it wasn't the threat of what Dolores might say that haunted them. It was what they had already done, what they could never undo. She didn't need to accuse them. She only needed to be there. To wake up each morning and open her curtains. To be seen and, in turn, to make them see themselves. Ethan stopped sleeping well. The house that had once been his victory now felt like a prison of his own making. And every time he looked out the window and saw his mother next door, he didn't see a woman seeking revenge. He saw someone who had once trusted him completely and now stood as proof of what he had destroyed. And that realization, slow and suffocating, was the punishment they had never anticipated. Autumn came again, slower than usual, as if the year itself had grown weary. The trees along the street shed their leaves one by one, just as silently as the truths that had stripped Ethan of every illusion he once held. The house he lived in no longer felt like his, not truly. He had started waking early, often before the sun, just to sit by the kitchen window and watch the faint light brush across the eaves of his mother's home next door. She still rose early, too. Dolores had always been a morning person, long before time and betrayal had tried to break her. She moved through her small garden with a kind of grace that no longer surprised him. It had never left her, only gone unseen. There was something almost defiant in the way she nurtured the earth, as if healing something that couldn't be named. And somehow, in the quiet repetition of tending to life, she reclaimed a dignity they had tried to take from her. The children had begun visiting her. First, just quick waves over the fence. Then cautious hellos. Then whole afternoons spent on her porch, listening to stories Ethan had forgotten, or perhaps never truly heard. He watched it all unfold with the gnawing ache of someone witnessing a kind of redemption they weren't sure they deserved to witness. She never spoke ill of him to them. That was what unraveled him most. Her silence, again, not as weapon, but as mercy. Amelia grew quieter with each passing week. The space between her and Ethan became something unspoken, vast and irreversible. She no longer spoke of the past, nor made plans for the future. There was a resignation in her eyes, a recognition that some choices carve so deep, no amount of denial can fill the wound. She had believed they were doing the right thing. Or at least, that was the story she had told herself, so often it had become her truth. But now, in the face of Dolores's quiet endurance, that truth crumbled. One evening, Ethan found himself standing at his mother's front door. He had no plan, no rehearsed speech, just the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. When the door opened, she looked at him not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a calm that undid him entirely. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, voice thin and raw. I want you to know I see it now. Everything I didn't see before. Everything I chose not to see." Dolores didn't answer right away. She stepped aside and let him in. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. On the table was a half-finished puzzle, birds in flight. She motioned for him to sit. "You were afraid," she said softly, finally. "Fear makes people cruel, Ethan." It's no excuse, but I understand it now. I wasn't strong enough, he whispered. She looked at him then, eyes clear and unwavering. But maybe you are now. They sat in silence for a long while. No sudden embrace, no grand reconciliation. Just the stillness of two people surrounded by what remained, and what could still be salvaged. As he left that night, Ethan looked back at the small house, its porch light casting a gentle glow. He realized then that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not arrive in a moment. It would be slow. It would live in the everyday, through the cracks mended quietly, through the stories she told her grandchildren, through the moments when shame gave way to honesty. The message was never shouted, never scrawled across a headline. It whispered instead, beneath the surface of everything, that love, when betrayed, does not die cleanly. It lingers. It waits. And sometimes it returns, not to punish, but to offer the one last chance to become someone worthy of it again. Some endings do not come with closure, only clarity. And sometimes that is enough.